Caroline had always been a dreamer. As a little girl growing up in a small Midwestern town, she would spend hours gazing out her bedroom window, imagining the grand adventures and passionate romances that surely awaited her beyond the cornfields and quiet streets. Now, at 28 years old, she found herself still dreaming, though her dreams had taken on a more wistful, bittersweet quality. She sighed as she stared out the window of her cramped studio apartment in Chicago, watching the city lights twinkle in the twilight. Another Friday night alone. Another week gone by without any excitement or romance to speak of. Her job as an administrative assistant at a law firm paid the bills, but left her feeling unfulfilled. The men she met through dating apps were nice enough, but none of them made her heart race or her palms sweat. Was this really all there was to life? Caroline's reverie was interrupted by the shrill ring of her cell phone. She glanced at the screen and saw it was her mother calling from back home. "Hi, Mum," she answered, trying to inject some cheerfulness into her voice. "Caroline, honey, how are you? I was just calling to check in and see how your week went." "Oh, you know, same old, Caroline replied with forced lightness. "Work's been busy, not much else new." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sweetheart, are you sure everything's all right? You sound a little down." Caroline felt a lump form in her throat. Her mother always could see right through her. "I'm fine, Mum, really, just a little lonely sometimes, I guess, but it's no big deal." "Oh, honey," her mother said softly, "I wish you would move back home. Your father and I miss you so much. And who knows, maybe you'd meet a nice boy here." Caroline closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "Mum, we've been over this. There's nothing for me there. At least here I have a decent job and possibilities. I just need to be patient." They chatted for a few more minutes before saying goodbye. As Caroline set down her phone, she felt the familiar ache of homesickness mixed with restlessness. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe she should just give up on her big city dreams and go back to the safety and comfort of her hometown. But even as the thought crossed her mind, Caroline knew she could never do it. For better or worse, she was committed to forging her own path and finding adventure, even if it killed her. With a determined set to her jaw, she grabbed her purse and headed out the door. She wasn't going to spend another Friday night moping around her apartment feeling sorry for herself. The streets were alive with energy as Caroline made her way through the bustling neighborhood. Young couples strolled hand in hand, groups of friends spilled out of bars laughing, music drifted from open windows. She breathed in the night air, already feeling her spirits lift. This was why she had moved to the city, to be surrounded by life and possibility. On a whim, she ducked into a small, dimly lit bar she had passed by many times, but never entered. The warm glow from inside beckoned invitingly. As her eyes adjusted to the low light, she took in the cozy space, dark wood paneling, vintage movie posters on the walls, the soft clink of glasses and murmur of conversation. It had an old-fashioned, almost timeless feel. Caroline made her way to the bar and perched on an empty stool. The bartender, a friendly-looking older man with salt and pepper hair, ambled over. "What can I get for you, miss?" Surprise me," Caroline said with a small smile. "Something not too strong, though." He nodded approvingly. "Coming right up." As the bartender busied himself mixing her drink, Caroline glanced around the room. It wasn't crowded, but there were a decent number of patrons scattered about. Couples in intimate conversation, a few solitary drinkers like herself. Her gaze landed on a man sitting alone at the end of the bar, nursing what looked like a whiskey. Even from a distance, she could tell he was strikingly handsome. Wavy dark hair, chiseled features, broad shoulders filling out a well-cut suit. But it wasn't just his looks that drew her attention. There was something in his posture, in the faraway look in his eyes as he stared into his drink, that spoke of melancholy. Caroline found herself intrigued despite herself. The bartender set a pale pink cocktail in front of her, garnished with a twist of lemon. "Here you go, my own creation. I call it New Beginnings. Let me know what you think." Caroline took a sip, and her eyes widened in pleasure. It was light and refreshing, with hints of grapefruit and elderflower. "It's delicious," she told the bartender. "Thank you." As she savoured her drink, she found her gaze continually drifting back to the handsome stranger. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was about him that fascinated her so. Maybe it was simply that he seemed as lost in thought as she had been earlier, a kindred, lonely soul on a Friday night. Just then, as if sensing her attention, the man looked up and their eyes met. Caroline felt her breath catch. His eyes were a striking shade of blue-green, like the ocean on a stormy day. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other from across the bar. Then, to her surprise, the corner of his mouth quirked up in a small smile. Almost involuntarily, Caroline smiled back. Before she quite knew what was happening, the man had picked up his drink and was making his way towards her. Caroline's heart began to race. What was she doing? She never flirted with strange men in bars. But something about this felt different, fated almost. "Good evening," the man said as he reached her, his voice a pleasant baritone. "I hope you don't mind me coming over, but I couldn't help noticing you from across the room. I'm Hudson." "Caroline," she replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "It's nice to meet you, Hudson." "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty stool beside her. At her nod, he sat down. "So, Caroline, what brings you out tonight?" She laughed a little self-consciously. "Oh, you know, just trying to shake off a case of the Friday night blues, I suppose. How about you?" A shadow seemed to pass over Hudson's face. "Much the same, I'm afraid. It's been a difficult week." "I'm sorry to hear that," Caroline said softly. On impulse, she reached out and lightly touched his arm. "Do you want to talk about it?" Hudson looked at her in surprise, as if he wasn't used to such gestures of kindness from strangers. Then his expression softened. "That's very kind of you, but I wouldn't want to burden you with my troubles." "It's no burden," Caroline assured him. "Sometimes it helps to talk to someone removed from the situation, and I'm a very good listener." Hudson studied her for a long moment, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. Then he sighed and took a sip of his drink. "Well, the short version is that I recently went through a rather messy divorce. It was finalized this week, in fact. I thought I'd be relieved, but instead I just feel lost." Caroline's heart went out to him. No wonder he had looked so melancholy earlier. "I'm so sorry, Hudson. That must be incredibly difficult." He nodded, looking down at his glass. "Thank you. It hasn't been easy, that's for sure. Jenna and I were together for 10 years, married for 5. I really thought she was the one, you know? But it turns out we wanted very different things out of life." "May I ask what happened?" Caroline inquired gently. Hudson was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "Well, I suppose it had been building for a while, but things really came to a head when I was offered a big promotion at work. It would have meant relocating to New York. I was thrilled. It was an incredible opportunity. But Jenna, she refused to even consider it. Said she could never leave Chicago, that all her family and friends were here." He took another sip of whiskey. "I tried to compromise, offered to turn down the job, look for other opportunities here. But it was like a switch had flipped. Suddenly everything I did irritated her. We fought constantly. Eventually she told me she had fallen out of love with me, that she felt suffocated. And that was that." "Oh, Hudson, I'm so sorry," Caroline murmured. Without thinking, she reached out and squeezed his hand. "That must have been awful for you." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her with an unreadable expression. "Thank you, Caroline. You're very kind to listen to me ramble on like this. I'm sure it's not how you plan to spend your evening." Caroline smiled. "Actually, this is the most interesting conversation I've had in ages. My evenings are usually pretty dull, to be honest." "I find that hard to believe," Hudson said, his eyes twinkling. "A beautiful, compassionate woman like you must have men lining up to take you out." Caroline felt herself blush at the compliment. "Ha! Hardly. My love life has been decidedly lacking in excitement lately, or ever, really." "Well then, the men of Chicago are clearly fools," Hudson declared. He raised his glass. "Here's to new beginnings for us both." Caroline clinked her glass against his, feeling a spark of electricity as their fingers brushed. "To new beginnings," she echoed. As they continued to talk, Caroline found herself captivated by Hudson. He was intelligent and well-spoken, with a dry sense of humour that frequently made her laugh. And the more they chatted, the more his initial melancholy seemed to lift. His smile came more easily, his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. Before she knew it, hours had passed. The bar had mostly emptied out around them, but Caroline barely noticed. She and Hudson were lost in their own little world, leaning in close to hear each other over the music, knees touching under the bar. Finally, the bartender came over to inform them he was closing up for the night. Caroline glanced at her watch in shock. It was nearly 2 a.m. "Oh my goodness, I had no idea it had gotten so late," she exclaimed. "I'm so sorry for keeping you out, Hudson. You probably have to work tomorrow." He smiled and shook his head. "Not at all. This has been the most enjoyable evening I've had in a very long time. I should be thanking you." As they gathered their things and stepped out into the cool night air, Caroline felt a pang of regret that the evening was ending. She wasn't ready to say goodbye to Hudson just yet. Apparently, he felt the same way. "Would you like to take a walk?" he asked. "It's such a beautiful night. Seems a shame to end it so soon." Caroline nodded eagerly. "I'd love to." They strolled side by side down the quiet streets, continuing their conversation. Caroline found herself opening up to Hudson in a way she rarely did with anyone, let alone someone she had just met. She told him about her dreams of becoming a writer, her struggles to find her place in the big city, her fears that she was wasting her life. Hudson listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and support. "I think you're being too hard on yourself," he told her. "You're young, you're pursuing your passion. That takes courage. And from what you've told me, you're a very talented writer. I have no doubt you'll succeed if you keep at it." His faith in her abilities warmed Caroline from the inside out. It had been so long since anyone had really believed in her like that. As they walked, Hudson's hand brushed against hers. Almost unconsciously, their fingers intertwined. Caroline's heart skipped a beat at the contact. It felt so natural, so right. Eventually, they found themselves in a small park. The first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the eastern sky. They sat down on a bench overlooking a small pond, still holding hands. "I can't believe we've been out all night," Caroline said with a soft laugh. "I never do things like this." "Neither do I," Hudson admitted, "but I'm very glad I did tonight." He turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. "Caroline, I know we've only just met, and I know my life is complicated right now, but I feel a connection with you that I can't ignore. Would you like to have dinner with me sometime? A proper date?" Caroline's breath caught in her throat. "Yes, 1,000 times yes," her heart cried out, but a small voice of caution in the back of her mind made her hesitate. "Hudson, I would love to, but are you sure you're ready? You're still dealing with your divorce, and I wouldn't want to be a rebound." He shook his head firmly. "You could never be just a rebound, Caroline. I know it seems fast, but being with you tonight has made me feel more alive than I have in years. I don't want to let that go." Caroline searched his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity there. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay, yes, I would love to have dinner with you." Hudson's face broke into a radiant smile. Then, moving with aching slowness, he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise. Caroline felt it all the way down to her toes. When they finally broke apart, they were both a little breathless. "Wow," Caroline whispered. "Wow, indeed," Hudson agreed with a chuckle. As the sun began to rise over the Chicago skyline, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Caroline leaned her head on Hudson's shoulder. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly hopeful about the future. Whatever happened next, she knew her life would never be the same after this night. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind for Caroline. She and Hudson went on several more dates, each one better than the last. He took her to elegant restaurants, to art galleries, to the theatre, but some of their best moments were the quiet ones, cooking dinner together at his place, taking long walks by the lake, staying up late into the night talking about everything and nothing. Caroline found herself falling hard and fast. Hudson was everything she had ever dreamed of in a partner. Kind, intelligent, passionate, with a quiet strength that made her feel safe and cherished. When she was with him, all of her doubts and insecurities seemed to melt away. For the first time, she felt truly seen and appreciated for who she was. There were challenges, of course. Hudson was still dealing with the aftermath of his divorce, which sometimes cast a shadow over their budding relationship. And Caroline couldn't help but worry that she was just a rebound, that Hudson's feelings for her weren't as deep as hers were for him. But every time those doubts crept in, Hudson seemed to sense it and would go out of his way to reassure her. "You're not a rebound, Caroline," he told her one night as they cuddled on his couch. "What I feel for you is real, more real than anything I felt in a very long time." Caroline wanted desperately to believe him, and most of the time she did. But there was still a small part of her that was afraid to fully give her heart away. About a month into their relationship, Hudson invited Caroline to accompany him to a work gala. It was a black tie affair at one of the city's most prestigious hotels. Caroline was both excited and nervous. This would be their first time attending a public event together, and she knew many of Hudson's colleagues would be there. As she got ready in her tiny apartment, fussing with her hair and makeup, Caroline's phone buzzed with a text from Hudson. "Can't wait to see you tonight, beautiful. You're going to take my breath away. I just know it." Caroline smiled, feeling a warm glow of happiness. How had she gotten so lucky? When Hudson picked her up, his jaw quite literally dropped at the sight of her. Caroline had splurged on a floor-length gown in deep emerald green that hugged her curves in all the right places. Her hair was swept up in an elegant updo, and she wore the delicate gold necklace Hudson had given her for her birthday. "My God, Caroline," Hudson breathed. "You look absolutely stunning." Caroline blushed with pleasure. "You clean up pretty well yourself, handsome," she teased, taking in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. At the gala, Caroline found herself swept up in a whirlwind of introductions. Hudson proudly showed her off to his colleagues and their spouses, his hand a warm, reassuring presence on the small of her back. Everyone was polite, but Caroline could sense an undercurrent of curiosity and speculation. She knew they were treading on dangerous ground. The connection between Caroline and Hudson had grown rapidly, intensifying with each shared moment and conversation. Despite her initial hesitation, Caroline found herself falling deeper for this man who had so recently ended his marriage. As they mingled with Hudson's colleagues at the gala, Caroline could sense curious glances and whispered speculation. She knew they were wondering about her relationship with Hudson, likely questioning if she was the reason for his divorce. The weight of their scrutiny made her increasingly uncomfortable. Hudson seemed oblivious to it all, proudly introducing Caroline and keeping her close by his side throughout the evening. His hand on the small of her back felt both comforting and dangerous, a reminder of their intimate connection, but also of the complicated situation they were in. As the night wore on, Caroline found herself struggling to maintain her composure. The champagne flowed freely, and with each glass, her inhibitions lowered. She laughed too loudly at Hudson's jokes, leaned in too close when he whispered in her ear. She knew they were drawing attention, but found it harder and harder to care. It was during a quiet moment, when Hudson had stepped away to speak with a colleague, that Caroline overheard a snippet of conversation that made her blood run cold. "I heard his ex-wife is devastated," a woman's voice said in a hushed tone. "Apparently he left her for some young thing he met at work. Can you imagine?" Caroline's heart began to race. Is that what people thought of her? A homewrecker who had broken up a marriage? The room suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. She needed air. Excusing herself, Caroline hurried out onto a balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air helped clear her head, but did little to calm the turmoil in her heart. She gripped the railing tightly, trying to steady herself. She knew they had rushed into this relationship. She knew there were complications and potential consequences they hadn't fully considered. But in that moment, faced with the harsh judgment of others, Caroline began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. When Hudson found her a few minutes later, concern etched on his handsome face, Caroline forced a smile. But inside, doubt had taken root. She knew they would need to have a serious conversation about their future, and whether they truly had one together at all. As they left the gala that night, hand in hand, Caroline felt a mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. Love and excitement warred with fear and uncertainty. She knew they were at a crossroads, and the path they chose would shape both their lives irrevocably. Whatever came next, Caroline knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again.